everyone. I'm Rory McGuire. I'm a professor and extension specialist at Virginia Tech, and I am for the soil because the soil is our future. We don't make any more of it. If you eat, you rely on soil.
Let's get this podcast started. Hey, everybody, I'm Jeff Ishii, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. My co-host, Dr. Eric Benfelt with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, and Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition are my co-hosts this week. And Mary, I think we can reintroduce a returning guest.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, we have Bob Waring with us again for a second episode. Bob runs Brandon Farms out a little in the eastern part of the state and is also with the Colonial Soil and Water Conservation District as a senior conservation specialist. So welcome back, Bob. To kick things off, I would love to hear, you work with a lot of farmers through the Soil and Water Conservation District, but also through your farmer to farmer engagement and mentoring. I think one of the challenges we hear with cover crops and other innovative approaches is that challenge of taking the jump, taking the leap and taking that risk. How do you advise farmers to manage that risk related to soil health?
That's a really good question. How to get farmers to embrace soil health, embrace cover crops. And I think in part it's farmers talking to farmers. I think that's the first thing that we have to understand, and we need to focus our efforts in there. And it could be something as simple as having a half a dozen farmers come to your farm and experience what you do. And in fact, I've had about 3 or 4 farmers asked to come watch. This year, they're going to come watch vetch being rolled and planted, and just to see and see how things work. You can talk to them about what the goods and the bads are, and there are a lot of bads, trust me. So one of the things that I try to get farmers to understand that is, don't go in and do everything, the entire farm, with some of these practices, but experiment. And that's what I do. I take 2 small fields or 3 fields or what have you, and I'll go play with those fields, and I'll experiment with them and then figure out, yeah, don't do that again because that was a disaster. Or, this is something that came out of what we found this year, and we then take that principle and we'll experiment further next year on that principle. And I've done that over the past couple of years. Somewhere in the field, we'll cut a boom off and when we're applying nitrogen, and we'll see what happens with that corn with no nitrogen. How did the corn react? How did the soils react? How did the cover crop react? And that's how I kind of approach farmer to farmer mentoring, if you will. Try to help them along in that way.
And Bob, really sounds like a real people-centered focus. At the same time, we know that there's different technologies available to improve sustainable or persistent agriculture. How do you find the balance of focusing on the farmer as well as technologies that are out there?
I think we're all going down this path to water quality, soil health, and I think we've got 2 different paths. They're both very good paths, and one is variable rate precision agriculture type, whether it's satellite, drones, or what have you. And then we have the other side where we're more natural, we're more cover crop based, what have you. And I think there's an opportunity to bring the 2 together. And in fact, I'm looking this year we're more on the natural side, looking at how we're using vetch as our source of nitrogen, a major source of nitrogen, as well as phosphorus and potassium in front of our corn. And we're cutting back nitrogen and inputs. We're going to utilize satellites this year, and they're going to give us an NEVI map of our vetch field just prior to planting, probably a week or 2 prior to planting. I'm going to take that map and where we have good places, bad places in the field, I'm going to do biomass samples. I'm going to look at nitrogen values on those maps from satellites. And then I'm going to hand that to our fertilizer dealer. And I'm going to see if we can vary the rate of nitrogen based off of our biomass, vetch biomass maps. I think that's where we're headed in the future, or at least I think that's where we need to be going, because I think that would bring together precision agriculture and cover crops. And I almost think that we can begin to use those biomass maps not only for nitrogen, but for phosphorus and potassium as well. More so potassium because of the way that it comes out of these plants. And maybe limiting the amount of potassium we have to apply, which is a great cost savings in front of corn. I think that's where we can be in the future. So we're going to focus efforts this year.
We are talking today with Bob Waring. He is with Brandon Farms in Essex County, Virginia. And Bob, I want to bring up something that you mentioned in the first podcast we recorded with you, and I'll remind our listeners that you can go to our website, forthesoil.org, and just click on the podcast, and there you'll see part 1 of our conversation with Bob Waring of Brandon Farms. But Bob, you said something that it almost took my breath away. You kind of insinuated, no, you actually said it, that you're going to try to grow a crop of corn with no fertilizer. And that was mind-boggling for a moment, if you will, because, you know, a generation ago, we learned this new term, no-till. Is it possible we could become a no-fertilizer farmer?
I think that I think we can reduce a good bit of that. There are farms across the U.S. There are different soils and different climates, and et cetera. We're very sandy in this part of the world. But I do believe that, yes, we can begin to significantly cut back what we're doing. That part of the issues is that there are phosphorus and potassium there is in the soil, but not all of it is available. And the way we make it available is by way of utilizing cover crops to sort of the microbes begin to break down and take up and release, make available these phosphorus and potassium. So to speak to what you're saying, I've got 2 small fields in right now, wheat fields, and typically in this part of the world, we put in double crop soybeans behind that wheat crop. Well, I'm going to forego the double crop soybeans, and I'm going to put in behind wheat. When we pull the wheat off in June, I'm going to put in a summer cover crop mix. It will be about 6 or 7 species. There'll be 2 legumes. There'll be buckwheat, sunflower. There'll be a couple grasses, some Sudan grass, some millet, and so forth in there. And they're all summer cover. So when it does get cold, they will die and begin to break down and release those nutrients. Into that, I'm going to try to plant vetch. And so my theory is that I will produce my phosphorus potassium, or release my phosphorus potassium for next year's corn crop. I do think that with the legumes that I'm going to have in through the summer and then the vetch in the fall, I think I stand a good chance of growing my average corn crop in those 2 small fields with no nitrogen. We'll see. This past year, sometimes it takes a mess up to come up with something new, and
every farmer knows that.
Every farm, and we had a mess up over the last 2 years. We've had 2 mess ups, but that mess up, we only put on 40 pounds of nitrogen on our corn crop, and we cut just shy of 190 bushels of corn. And so the rest of that nitrogen came from vetch. So I do believe I can make up the other 40 pounds through that summer cover crop and maybe exceed that. But the other interesting thing that I don't think folks understand when you're talking about reducing fertilizer, even something even bigger than that is reducing lime. And we have reduced lime on the farm. I would say in the last 6 years, we've only limed about 10% of our acres. And I think that a lot of it is coming from the buffering faction. And I asked Dr. Franz Lubers at NC State, why is this happening? Why are we not liming as much? And he said that these cover crops begin to take out the fluctuations per se in the pHs. And so I think that's why we're starting to see, and that's a huge input. That's probably bigger than what fertilizer would be.
And Bob, I feel like I can ask this because you also work with the state and have a long, have worked, with the state and locally in conservation for many years. how do we, we see a lot of farmers really doing innovative work on the farm. Are you seeing that trickle up to practitioners and to the state, and how do we encourage that knowledge transfer?
From what we're doing up into, I think I think we're headed in that direction. I do. I think that whether it's companies, whether it's states in general, I think they are starting to see the benefits of climate agricultural and what we do. And when I say climate agricultural, again, and that's what I'm doing with Colonial Soil and Water District right now, is working with climate smart principles. And I think that these companies are beginning to understand that that's an important part of what we're doing. And I think we're going to see that the companies begin to move in that direction, and it's going to become, I think, a major part of what we do in the future as far as agricultural. If we can get some younger farmers coming in, and that's where I see the benefit, is the younger farmers that are coming in have the technological background. They understand what's happening, and they are interested. A lot of these smaller producers, that whether they have 5 acres of vegetables or whether they have 1,000 acres or what have you of crops, they're starting to understand the benefits of cover crops and soil health and what we're doing. And I believe we're at the beginning of a movement. And that's why I'm happy to be where I am, because I think districts across the U.S. are going to be the focus of what we're doing in the future, as far as dealing with farmers and pushing that up to what you're saying to the state and federal levels. So,
and Bob, we always like to ask, like, who inspired you in your process and farming and interest in soil health and conservation?
I have dealt with a whole lot of innovative farmers through my time at state, and Mark Ryder and Wade Tomlinson, the specialist at Virginia Tech. I've done a lot of work with them over the past couple of years. Joey Haymaker on the Eastern Shore. They've been on the farm over the past couple of years working with that Precision Sustainable Agriculture project, the PSA project, and that essentially is they're looking at we have several strips. We have a cover crop, no cover crop, in replicated strips, and they were looking at water management and heat management, and I've learned a lot from them, and it's inspired me to go do my own research. I'll tell you this, it's sort of funny, but I took over. They had Joey had his plots on our farm last year, and I kind of took them over and did my own stuff on them. And I actually went out there one Sunday afternoon. It was hot. Oh my gosh, it was hot. It was beans were about a foot tall. It was dry, and I actually had a moisture meter, and I took a moisture samples every inch down to 4 inches in the cover crop and the no cover crop plots. And in fact, it was cooler at 1 inch deep underneath the cover crop than it was at 4 inches deep at the no cover. And so, in part, and why we are seeing greater yields underneath these cover crops. Jeff spoke of that earlier, or asked that question earlier. I think in part of it is because the sun is not beating on the soil. It's the cover crop is kind of an armor to that soil, and it's not allowing the sun to pull the moisture out of the
It's
ground.
almost like a miniature forest.
Absolutely, and if you're protecting the moisture in that soil and not letting the sun pull it out, well, then that moisture can then get into the corn plant or the soybean plant. So, I think that's why we're starting to see more resiliency out of these cash crops when you have that barrier on top of the soil. We had in 2020 versus 2023, we had the corn in the field at the home place, and there's a lot of variables in place, but there was a 42 bushel increase, and the only difference was cover crop versus no cover crop. And I honestly think that a lot of it, the moisture was exactly the same, because we have a NOAA weather station on the farm. And so I looked at all the weather data, and there was no difference. And so I simply think that with no water, we have to, and I heard a farmer in Texas say this one time when I was on a panel down there. He said, down in Texas, they try to harvest their rainwater. And I said, that's a great statement, because we need to start employing that up here. And when you get a little bit of rain, you have to try to hold on to everything you get, especially during the heat of the summer. And I think that's where these cover crops have come into play. So.
Well said. We're talking today with Bob Waring with Brandon Farms in Essex County. And Bob, unfortunately, our time is up for this episode, but I want to thank you for taking the time. I know this is a busy time of the year for Virginia farmers and for farmers all across America. This is an extremely busy time of the year. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And Eric and Mary, we'll catch you in the next one.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff and Bob.
And we do have a couple of moments remaining in the podcast today, and I always think it's necessary that every once in a while we just go back and take a look at the basics. We talk about for the soil, that's the digit for the soil, and what are the 4 components of soil health? Number 1, keep soil covered. Number 2, minimize soil disturbance. Number 3, maximize living roots. And number 4, energize with diversity. If you want to see all of the basics that we're talking about here, you can visit the website forthesoil.org. That is the digit 4, thesoil.org. For the Soil, a Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. And if you should have a specific question about soil health, just call your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.